The 1970s is a quite interesting time for British movie making. The 1960s saw a boom in what we now describe as kitchen sink or angry young men dramas such as The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner and Saturday Night and Sunday Morning. And of course we get some excellent horror films by the likes of Hammer Horror Studios at Bray and Elstree, and we get Amicus making some fantastic movies and the little known studio Tygon as well. However, as we crawl into the 1970s, what was known as the Eadie levy had started to dry up slightly. This was a complex rule which meant that there was money put aside for productions made in Britain if 85% of the cast were indeed British. That's including people that worked on the film, and they were only allowed 3 international stars in the pictures. The film The Wicker Man has many excellent things going for it, and let's explore some of these now. First of all, there's the excellent script by Anthony Shaffer and some fantastic direction by Robin Hardy. Another thing going for it is the cast, and what a cast. Christopher Lee in one of his most definitive roles, one that he considered his best and one of his standout performances as Lord Summeral is purely fascinating. Of course, you also get Britt Ekland as well, who was a massive star in the early 70s globally, not just because of her marriage to Peter Sellers and her relationship with Rod Stewart, but also some really interesting roles in Get Carter, which is one of Britain's greatest gangster films, and also appearing in the James Bond film in the early 70s, The Man with a Golden Gun, alongside Roger Moore. There are some smaller, interesting roles in the film. Ingrid Pitt is criminally underused and quite underdressed in the film. She was a big star in Hammer's latter day and also appeared in the Amicus anthology film The House That Dripped Blood. Also appearing in the film is Diane Cilento, perhaps best known for being married to Sean Connery throughout most of the 1960s. Quite interestingly enough, she'd retired from acting at the time but returned for this role. She actually has a small appearance in one of the James Bond films in You Only Live Twice, but this is merely body doubling for one of the diving girls during one of the Japanese island sequences. There are some interesting smaller performances as well. Ingrid Pitt is criminally underused and quite underdressed in a small role. She was famous for appearing in some of the latter Hammer horror films, and appears in the Amicus anthology The House That Dripped Blood, one of her better performances. Interestingly enough, to mention those studios, that Hammer and Amicus were getting dwindling box office returns, so people wanted a new flavour of horror. And what was interesting was that Hammer and Amicus were relying on old glories, making Dracula films and Frankenstein films over and over again. These were getting increasingly more sexualised and featuring more gratuitous nudity and violence. A lot of this is a typical trend in British cinema from the mid-60s into the 70s because of the relaxation of censorship laws. This was due to the failure to prosecute the book Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence under the Obscene Publications Act in the early 60s. So this brought about greater freedom for filmmakers and playwrights, etc. There's also a great appearance by Aubrey Morris as the gardener, who is perhaps had his most famous role in A Clockwork Orange, playing Mr. Deltoid, whose every other word is yeah. Also going for the film is an excellent score by the New Yorker Paul Giovanni, sadly no longer with us after dying of an AIDS-related illness in the early 1990s. He was more known for his stage work, and he got together a group of musicians which became known under the name of Magnet. The soundtrack is readily available. There are some standout tracks on there such as Corn, Rigs and Barley, The Landlord's Daughter, which is quite a humorous scene if you see it, Gently Johnny, and also the song Willow Song, which is part of a seduction ritual led by Britt Ekland. A sample of that song is actually used in the Eli Roth film Hostel, paying homage to this classic. There are some interesting points to the film. Britt Ekland's performance as dubbed. One of my favourite exchanges in the film is where Sergeant Howie, played by Edward Woodward, says, "Broad beans in the natural state aren't usually turquoise," to which Britt Ekland, Willow McGregor, replies, "Some things in the natural state have the most vivid of colours." What's interesting for a film that's sort of set in the springtime, the movie was actually made in autumn. So around the area that they filmed, they would actually staple and glue on bits of blossom onto the different trees. And what an area to film in. I've actually been to many of the locations, for you location hounds out there. Places you might want to check out is the area of Dumfries and Galloway. So if you go to the town of Newton Stewart, the town is just around the corner. If you go to the village of Kirkcudbright, all this is in southern Scotland, you will see the area where the part of the procession takes place. It's well worth researching the area and taking a visit, preferably with a soundtrack blaring, but try not to sacrifice any policemen on your trip. Now, could this film have been made earlier? Well, yes, certainly it could, but I don't think it would have been as good. The film The Wicker Man is very much on the end of a boom of cynicism towards religion. Jean-Francois Lyotard, a famous sociologist, argued for something called postmodernism, which in its simplest form is we've moved on from an industrialised time and started to question social institutions, one of which is religion. And I think the film has a certain element of bite to it, because here comes Sergeant Howie into community, flaunting his Christian values. He's so stuck in his system of the legal system and also the Christian system that he can't fully understand what's going on within the pagan community, and essentially that is part of his downfall. There are several different versions of the film available. The 84-minute theatrical cut, which was released at the time by British Lion, the parent company, has been dramatically savaged, because at the time they felt like it was one of the 10 worst films that they had ever seen. A bit harsh, okay? But at the time, British Lion had just been bought out by the media conglomerate EMI, and they weren't quite sure what to do with the picture. Also available is the 99-minute director's cut version, available on DVD, reassembled by Robin Hardy, which is much closer to his original vision. However, there are some scenes still missing, such as scene where Christopher Lee is talking about an apple. Some critics have criticised the film, arguing that there are great tonal shifts throughout the film. It's safe to say in production that Robin Hardy gathered the production team together to tell them that they're now making a musical, not just a straight-out horror thriller. And what great musical influences there are. Giovanni's score, Christopher Lee is in a terrific voice, and fans of Kate Bush might recognise the legendary Lindsay Kemp playing the landlord in the pub sequences. He designed some of her most famous routines and also choreographed some of David Bowie's most famous dances. There is a real sense of the kind of classic 70s downbeat ending to the film that we often see in films like Taxi Driver and The French Connection, which came from America. Spoilers here, but if you expect Sergeant Howie to go away, you'll be very disappointed. The only characters we can really relate to are involved in pagan rituals and dancing with naked Swedish supermodels. I'd prefer to stick to the latter. Quite interestingly enough, as a last little fact, is that the actual dancing done in the seduction scene, where Willem McGregor's facing away from the camera, is actually a body double, and incensed Britt Ekland, who wasn't too happy about the dimensions of that person playing her character. Now, interestingly, in America in the 1970s, Christopher Lee and the director Robin Hardy did a tour of American TV shows to promote the film, the rights of which were picked up by Roger Corman, who would often display the film as part of double features at drive-in cinemas. The film in the last 15 years or so has received a great critical reappraisal, led by the likes of critics Mark Kermode and Kim Newman, who consider it one of the greatest British horror films ever made. Not even a terrible Hollywood remake starring Nicolas Cage or a supposed reimagining by the original director Robin Hardy called The Wicker Tree could diminish what I would argue is one of the greatest British films of all time.